Welcome to the Atlanta Sci-Fi Film Festival's Afrofuturism panel. My name is Amanda Ray, and I have an exciting group of folks waiting to talk to you all about Afrofuturism. First up, we have Isis Asare, also known as Sistah Sci-Fi. She is the first Black-owned bookstore owner focused on Afrofuturism and science fiction, and is a cauldron of all things Afrofuturism: Black mysticism, science fiction, noir, and traditional voodoo, casting spells to uplift literature written by Black women. We also have Susana Morris, Associate Professor of Literature, Media, and Communications at Georgia Institute of Technology. She is passionate about Afrofuturism, Black feminism, and climate change. Currently, she's at work on a cultural biography of Octavia E. Butler entitled Positive Obsession: The Life and Times of Octavia E. Butler, Amistad 2024. Next, we have John Jennings, Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at the University of California at Riverside, where he examines the visual culture of race in various media forms, including film, illustrated fiction, comics, and graphic novels. Mr. Jennings is also an author and graphic novelist, curator, Harvard Fellow, New York Times bestseller, and two-time Eisner winner. Whew. You're doing a lot, John. And next we have Ayana Jamieson, who's the founder of Octavia E. Butler's Legacy Network. Dr. Jamieson has developed legacy tours that share the life and legacy of Butler's work and the historical and geographical landscape that shaped her. So the reason why I thought this was so important to have this panel is that for the first time this year, we opened up our film category to include Afrofuturism. A lot of people still are, confused about that word and term. It's a catch-all. I think a lot of times now, I think more recent films like Black Panther and Afrofuturism, and you'll talk about this in a moment, and anybody can jump in on this, has been around for a while, but it's only really the last few years that a couple of films and even literature and certain books have been, using the word, and we're using it a lot now. We're throwing a lot of films in this category. But as we saw with some of our submissions, we can tell there's still a lot of confusion around the word Afrofuturism. As we continue to accept more films and encourage filmmakers to create within this subcategory, if you will, we want to make sure that people are clear on the understanding of Afrofuturism, and also just give them ideas of where they can go with some of the narratives, right? So where we see ourselves in the future is so vital and so important, which is one of the reasons why I created this whole organization, right? So that we can write how we see ourselves in the future, how we're going to be impacted by technology, and what that all looks like for us as a race of people in this society. And, also when you think of even our past, anything that just affects us, what that can look like. So giving filmmakers all this like juicy stuff and things that they may not have thought about that they can write about now when they have a broader understanding of Afrofuturism. So I'll throw it out there first on the table for anyone to, we'll just go around, take your time and, answer the question, but what is Afrofuturism?
Afrofuturism, for me recently has been the idea of the Afrofuture has become more of a destination than anything, something to work towards, right? Just thinking about our political climate, but the term comes from an essay by Mark Derry, which was written in 1993 and was published in this collection called Flame Wars, and it was looking at the burgeoning of this thing called the World Wide Web, or internet culture, right? And this is of course the nascent aspects of what we now look at as the World Wide Web. And what he was looking at was at first Afrofuturism as being a cultural production method that actually had particular aspects to it that were dealing with cybernetic culture, that kind of thing. So he was using the two main kind of symbols of science fiction, the idea of the alien, because his whole thing was well, to a certain degree, we've already been alienated. We actually were brought from Africa and turned into slaves, and we've already been turned into aliens, right? The other thing was he was using the idea of the cyborg as kind of a metaphor for for Blackness or for double consciousness. So in a sense, Afrofuturism in that particular regard, the initial regard, was this kind of like cultural production method that was analyzing how people of color of the diaspora were utilizing science fiction to deal with, you know, the issues around intergenerational trauma through like science fiction, fantasy. I like to think of it as a, you know, a way to think about the future and the past simultaneously, because that's why this thing exists, you know. I think that basically like people who are thinking about Afrofuturism are utilizing it to talk about how do we think about technology, or how do we actually think about how people who are descended from folk who used to be technology, actually an extension, you know, of the master's whim, so to speak. How does someone like that actually negotiate, you know, the future? And to borrow from our friend Lisa Yazik, she actually likes to think of it as a reclamation of the history of the future, which I always like, right? Because if you look at like a lot of science fiction and fantasy that was generated like in the early 20th century, you know, people of color are not there. And so this is the thing too, it's like reclaiming the past, but also rewriting the future, but really actively thinking about like various modes of technology, and in different forms too, not just, you know, literature, but also music, comics, dance, all these different idioms, right? And I'm gonna stop talking because smarter people need to chime in. So I think I probably confused people more. I'm just kidding.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Anyway.
That actually gave me some ideas for a story too. So I think if other people are understanding it as well, they might be coming up with ideas now. So
Yeah, and I think I love John's definition. I love like the reference into like where it came from and that collection of essays. Whenever I'm asked, I also bring in Yatasha Womack's definition just because she wrote the book on Afrofuturism. So Afrofuturist redefine culture and notions of Blackness for today and the future. So it brings in like, it's not just the future, but it's also our present, but it's also rooted in Blackness and Black culture. And really like not just Black people using technology or Black people in the future, but really like that incorporating that cultural essence of the African diaspora, of the Black diaspora with technology. Like the two have to happen for me simultaneously.
I would say that in addition to defining technology as a machine, I think we can define technology as all kinds of natural sciences, medicine, astrophysics, technologies of the body, disease, evolution, the virology, right? Because some of the work that is done, as John said earlier, is that we were technology, or rather we were the vehicles and containers for experimentation, which furthered civilization. Like, let's think about Lilith and Lilith's brood. I'm sorry, I'm calling her Lilith, but I'm talking about HeLa cells. I'm talking about Henrietta Lacks. So her genetic material, which could circle the earth many times over and is the root of the immortal HeLa cell line. So when we're talking about Black people existing in the future, when in fact the argument is that very often what someone from the dominant culture would say is like, we don't have racism, therefore we don't need to worry about there being Black people. There's a very famous interview of Octavia Butler where she quoted someone on a panel saying, well, any Black people could be dealt with by way of extraterrestrials. And you see the look on her face, she's just disgusted and offended, but she's sitting here and they've sort of tokenized her. But she knows that there are technologies which are not necessarily related to the giant time machine, but actually your DNA and those cells and organelles and cell parts and the things that are left over, the residual things that rub off in terms of energy, beliefs, all kinds of technologies, and that this innovation is what John, I think, calls like Black speculative. It's a Black speculative engagement. And I feel like I agree with him in that Afrofuturism has been redefined by people like Rashida Phillips and Dee Denenge Akkem, who are not just writing stories and creating stories, they're actually changing the actual landscape in which we inhabit. Rashida is a housing rights lawyer. So she's literally going back to occupy spaces. Like Isis's bookstore is a form of technology. It has its own Afrofuturist, Black speculative arts movement push that represents a need that already exists, that we are growing into, that she is putting out for us in the future. There, you know, the Free Black Women's Library, there's so many folks making moves. You know, I could name Ruha Benjamin and Moya Bailey, people talking about race after technology and all of these other aspects of living, breathing, relational, you know, emotional, psychological things that are happening that have material consequences for Black folk. And that's what I include in my definition of Afrofuturism and the diaspora, I think.
Yeah, just to round off what everyone has said, which is also brilliant, is I would add that Afrofuturism is a cultural movement. And it's oftentimes discussed as a genre, but I think it's beyond a genre, right? So all the things that Ayana just mentioned, that Isis is doing with her bookstore, that John mentioned in terms of tracing the trajectory of the term, it's a cultural movement that spans multiple genres. So you could be a filmmaker, you could be someone working in the fine arts, whether you're doing algorithmic art like Natrice Gaskins, or you're doing multimedia collage like Wangechi Mutu. You could be a musician, whether we're talking about Missy Elliott or Janelle Monáe or Outkast or LaBelle or Parliament Funkadelic or Sun Ra, and on and on and on. You could be working like, you know, the folks in Black quantum futurism that Ayana just mentioned, you know, doing housing rights, but also creating music and creating theory, right? Thinking through space and time, creating counterpaths and create counter futures. You could be thinking through architecture. I have a colleague here at Georgia Tech, Vernell Noel, that's thinking through carnival, right? And she's sort of thinking through Afrofuturism and carnival spaces and making structures that are Afrofuturistic. So it spans multiple disciplines and multiple genres. It's a cultural movement that's inviting us to think through these issues of space, time, and technology.
Before moving, one other thing too I wanted to state was, I feel, and it's something that Yatasha Womack talks about too, is that it's a very Black womanist centered movement too. I mean, just look at the makeup of our panel, right? The major players who are creating the work are, you know, it's the work of Black women who are centered, I think, a lot more in this particular cultural movement.
Yeah, no, you know, you're absolutely right. I think even when I go online and look up an article or something like that, and you look at the person who wrote the article, anything dealing with Afrofuturism, usually, you know, it's a female editor. So that's a good point. One quick question that I want to throw out to you guys. So when did everyone first, Black Futurists, there you go.
Exactly.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Case in point. Has everyone here, the first time they heard of the word Afrofuturism, was it introduced to you along with the definition, or did you hear about it first and didn't know what it was about or didn't know anything about it? And what was your thoughts on it before you found out, if you found out before you knew the definition, if that makes sense? Hopefully I didn't confuse you.
Yeah, I mean, and that's so fascinating. Because I can't remember when I was introduced to the term, but I knew that whether I knew the term or what I meant, I knew I loved it and I was about that life. And it's like anything from like Erykah Badu's like music video, like on and like, and it was a love story, but she literally time traveled with that love story and like seeing like that different time periods and going like super into the future. Or if it was Alice Walker's Temple of My Familiar, where again, you have somebody like remembering their different lives. And, you know, it was so like, it wasn't dubbed as science fiction, but it was very taking Black culture and spinning it and make it speculative. Or if it was Andre 3000's Prototype, where he literally comes to Earth as an alien. And I was like, I love this, I'm about this. I'm going to see more Black people taking sci-fi and reclaiming it and mixing it with our culture. And I don't really know the term, and I don't know if, I think it's recently where I codified the definition for myself, but I know that like on a very emotional level, Afrofuturism across all mediums spoke to me because I love technology, and I love technology that creates opportunities for all of us, Black people, women, queer people, people who historically have not had access to major sources of capital. And no place does that the way technology does, the way science fiction does. So yeah.
I want to take you back. I cannot say that I heard a term or that I feel like one thing that we can critique validly, Mark Derry was nice for coining the term, but the fact Afrofuturist or Black speculative art was something that we've been doing since time immemorial, since before we were writing things down. And for me personally, one thing I do remember, my parents are now divorced for over 40 years, but what I do remember is them listening to Earth, Wind and Fire on albums. So I was growing up looking at these album covers that have pyramids and these circles and space and knowing all these lyrics without ever consciously listening to these things. My father is an immigrant from Jamaica. There are more people outside of the diaspora than there are on the island, right? And that is a technological move where my mom was helping them figure out how to fill out the paperwork for their visas. How do you use the resources that are usually limited to you to gain access to something that will allow me personally, Ayana Jamieson, to exist in the present? So it's very personal, material, but yes, Earth, Wind and Fire, again, LaBelle, when we see LaBelle dressed and these like metallic bustiers, etc., like we're watching these images and hearing these sounds. And of course, growing up in the 80s, all of the remixing, sampling, jazz improvisation, there was so much always going on. It's really a loop. It's like an infinity loop. It's not a linear thing. And I think filmmakers have an opportunity to really, really open themselves up to tapping into all of these riches and resources that we're not just theorizing about, we're living. And I think people are now catching up to what artists and cultural workers have been doing for hundreds of years, I want to say. In terms of experimentation and thriving. And maybe Black women are heading this movement in a philosophical way because our mothers and grandmothers and aunties figured out how to both raise their children and be maids, both get educated and do both and, not either or, and not let, like Nichelle Nichols is the ultimate, it's today that we're filming this is the 50 some odd years past Star Trek, right?
Right.
So she is a mother, she's a dancer, she's there in a short skirt, but she's a communications officer running the space switchboard, and she speaks many languages, and she's the one that is interfacing with the beyond that's outside of the ship. And so, and then she went to recruit people into the actual space program, including the first minoritized and Black women astronauts. So there's so many opportunities for filmmakers to be part of that culture and have representation where we're not just the guy who comes in at the end, like Donald Glover in is it Inception, where he goes and flies a stapler around and he's like the messenger or the magical Negro who expounds on how to solve all the problems of the spaceship and help all the white people reseed the galaxy and colonize things. Like we've been doing more than that.
So I do have a particular time when I heard the term. I was actually still at the University of Illinois teaching, and I had put together a series of Black cyborg images. It was like around 2007, 2008. And I had become really interested in I guess you would call it techno-orientalism, is what some people call like the use of basically particularly Japanese usage of technology and robots and things of that nature. And I was doing a show in Kyoto, and I became really interested in how that related to Black culture. And I was thinking about double consciousness. I think I just reread Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, and then I was looking at Frantz Fanon's work again, The Fact of Blackness. And I was, and I made these images of cyborgs, and I wanted to do is, I created these amalgams of the idea that again, the Black body has always been kind of, this fungible artifact, this replaceable artifact. And then these stereotypes, which deal primarily with fixity, have been like updated and changed a little bit, but they're still kind of like the same ideas, And so I end up creating like 70 or so of these digital images, but that also made them look like woodcuts because I wanted to kind of capture the idea of like of an ancient technology or older technology at the same time. And a friend of mine who was Africanist, who studied like African art, she looked at the work and she was like, "Oh, this looks Afrofuturist." And my first reaction to it was like, "That's a made up word. That's not a thing." What are you talking about? Yeah, and I had never heard the term. Now, mind you, this is around the same time that, Janelle Monáe, I think, was starting to kind of break the charts and stuff like that too. So I started to actually have like a reference point. And then I started doing research around it. And to kind of like piggyback off of what Ayana was saying, dairy in his definition, and this is something that I think my colleague was looking at too, was really looking at it as a formal expression, like a style, a style is a system of decisions essentially. And so this is what was kind of like transpiring, I think, when they were thinking about it as stylistic conventions, right? And not necessarily as we've stated, a cultural movement, all these different ideas around it. And one thing I do like about Derry's definition, though, he says, because he's trying to figure it out too, he says, for want of a better term, it's in the middle of the definition. So he actually puts ambiguity in the middle of a definition, which I always find very interesting. Mm-hmm. The other thing is he also refers to it as a 20th century technoculture. So we're already like, what I'm saying? Like, we're talking about the future, but we're talking about the 20th century. We're in the 21st century. And also, again, really, really, again, dialing into what Ayana was saying too, is like this idea of what technology was. So these are different things that I was kind of wrestling with, when I was looking at the term. And also to kind of piggyback off of what other people have said is, we have been doing this type of cultural production work for a very long time. These days, I just call myself an Afro-speculative scholar. I just look at the Afro-speculative, just kind of like, just bring it all in, Mm-hmm. But I think a seminal work, again, by another wonderful Black woman, is Sherry Renee Thomas's work, Dark Matter, which actually like really gives us kind of like the Rosetta Stone to really reimagine. See there? Those the books. Yes. To really reimagine how we look at not only at ourselves through this particular speculative lens, but also really look backwards at what our forefathers and foremothers were writing, And then when you look at like, Du Bois's work or Zora Neale Hurston's work, then you start to realize that, we've been speculating about these things for a very long time. And as you stated, Ayana, they're just now catching up with us, which is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, quickly, I would say I can't remember the exact time when I heard the term, but I think I was in graduate school, so like early 2000s. And I was, studying kind of like Black feminist writing. I was, considering myself like a Morrison scholar. I really began my career studying Morrison and writing a lot about Morrison. But Octavia Butler was always there. She was always in the back of my mind. And I was like, I was in this kind of traditional literature program, even though my advisor was super into science fiction and fantasy. That was not something I learned until later, because she's like, "Oh, I study 19th century Black women's fiction, periodicals, I'm in the archives." And so I thought of those things as separate, right? Is there ways in which science fiction and fantasy the speculative gets kind of balkanized in a particular kind of way? And so I just remember like folks being like, "Yeah, this is Afrofuturism." I'm like, "Oh, I could write about this. I don't actually have to write about this other stuff as if it's separate. I don't have to keep these halves of my brain separate, right? Like the stuff that I'm reading for fun can be my life's work, right? Not that Morrison isn't fun, but I could bring the speculative into my research life. So that's how it came to be for me."
I have one really kind of burning question. It's a little bit of a weird question though, because I thought about asking it, so I was like, how do I ask this without it sounding kind of, I don't know, weird or just kind of, I don't know, challenging with the question. But so we have this, category in our film festival called Afrofuturism because we wanted to, bring more focus to people creating speculative fiction, speculative in that, you know, obviously with more African American people, right? So to separate and have a separate category, how do you guys feel about just in general Hollywood and how we have now? It's only in the last 20 years we have more science fiction than we can even handle, right? The whole genre has blew up. I remember when there was only like 1 or 2 movies that came out a year in science fiction when I was a kid growing up. And now there's it's like a dime a dozen. What's also really popular is diversity in science fiction, luckily, which is we're very thankful for that. When I started the multicultural sci-fi organization, there was this huge need to push for more of it. And not that we're going to stop, because it still needs to happen, but we have way more diversity in science fiction than we ever have before. So with people and filmmakers wanting to create within or create something that falls under the category of Afrofuturism, or they would like it to be in that category, how would you guys feel about Hollywood wanting to separate, or should we, what are your thoughts about creating our own lane and other people wanting to put us in that lane and take us out of the general science fiction category? What are your overall thoughts just about that in general?
So I'm a big fan of curation, right? I'm a big fan of creating our own lanes. I don't consider it segregation. Like when Shea Moisture was like, I don't understand why you have a black hair. I was like, so I can find the products that I need. You know, and you know, I was African American studies minor, and I remember at the graduation, people are like going to say like, this is segregation. That focus celebration of Black diasporan culture, so African American culture, Caribbean culture, African culture. And she was clear, like, as you go in the world, I want you to know this is not segregation, this is congregation, and to be proud of the work. So I think that celebration and that creating a lane of Black cinema, or Black literature, or Afrofuturism, or African futurism, which I think is a panel we should talk about, and celebrating the current work and the future work and the historical work going back from W.E.B. Du Bois, or I just discovered Pauline Hopkins. I was like, where's she been all my life, right? Or like Octavia Butler is needed. And if you don't have sometimes that focus, it's easy to just not see it, right? And just focus on like the 1 or 2 or 3. And there's hundreds out there, like right now, like people send me the same list of hundreds. I think it's like hundreds of just Black women writing in science fiction.
I think Black hair is a really good metaphor for how we can think about what it means to create Afrofuturism, and the critique that Octavia Butler and others have had, in that people think that science fiction or some kind of cultural movement always has to do with racism, when in fact we're out here enjoying ourselves and minding our business and raising our children and earning our degrees or working our jobs or whatever we're doing outside of whatever that those restrictions are from other people. We're already always living in that technology of joy as resistance. And there's hair is a good metaphor because it is the thing that everyone wants to comment on, regulate, legislate. But like Black hair, you may go to someone who helps you maintain it. They may or may not be a Black person. However, I'm not going to take anybody's advice or interpretations or instructions about what to do with my hair if they are not a person from the diaspora who can speak on that. And maybe filmmakers need to keep in mind the ways that representation sometimes pigeonholes people or tries to make statements about what they think the Blacks are doing, when in fact we're already living regular, normal people's lives. I feel like what was so forward thinking about Zora Neale Hurston's work is she's like, I'm just writing about being here. There's a scene where somebody's like scratching the skull, they're like combing through someone's hair and massaging their scalp. And there was no representation about this kind of embodied Black experience. And Afrofuturism can definitely create those situations where we can watch people thrive. And any film made in Hollywood, any film is going to take multiple people. And I think that there's some things that may come out being Afrofuturist that are not necessarily written by Black folks. And what I mean by that is we have Black helmed people who are taking a work and adapting it. Like, for example, Ava DuVernay is associated with these books for young people called The Wings of Fire about dragons. But I tell you that it's about what's happening in the world and how revolutionaries interpret what's going on and get integrated or not back into society, exactly where Black folks are standing in this current moment in terms of Black Lives Matter and these social movements and cultural movements that are ongoing. So I do think we need to know that these things that are produced with many, 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 many hands, but that we can still continue to look to people and look at the work that's being done and who is having an impact on what the final product is and whether or not we can call it Afrofuturist, if that makes sense.
It's one, the thing about segregation that's so interesting when people bring up, oh, folks are segregating themselves. Segregation is a structure that's not created by Black folk, right? So there's not really the word segregation does not make sense, right? So congregation, as you were saying, Isis, that makes sense, right? But this idea that folks who are marginalized within a white supremacist culture would have the structural power to segregate themselves does not make sense. We just don't have the structural power. So if Black folk, or as you were just mentioning, Ayana, a multicultural group of people want to create a film that's about, say, Black superheroes or something like that, then that catering to, I don't know, African diasporic cultural traditions and so on, that's not segregation, because it's just not, it cannot be. So I think just words matter and language matters. I think it's perfectly fine for us to create art that speaks to lots of different slices of life. So if we're thinking about Afrofuturism and horror, I just saw Candyman this past weekend. Horror is going to deal with trauma, so that's oftentimes connected. If we're talking about Black folk and trauma, racial trauma, it doesn't have to be, right? But it might, right? Maybe something that's thinking about counter futures might not engage race or racism at all, but have a bunch of Black folk, right? So I show, for example, the short film Poomsy in my classes a lot. And my students love it. And they're like, yeah, this is about race and racism. And I'm like, but is it though? Like, let's talk, it seems to be about lots of things, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be about racism as we understand it, but they're sort of primed to see Black folk and think, this is a short film about racism, right? And it's a short film that's futuristic, Afrofuturistic, in which, there's no water, folks are trying to create energy through using treadmills and things, pre-Black Mirror. And the protagonist is trying to fight to get to the outside world, and really race as we know, even gender as we know it, does not exist. It's a completely different formulation, right? There's lots of different, I think about A Taste of Honey, the novella A Taste of Honey, which everybody should read. It's so beautiful and very hot, and very queer. And it's a world in which race as we understand it does not exist, but homophobia does, right? So there's lots of different ways to envision counter past or counter futures and so on, and that we can have African diasporic practices and cultural histories and cultural futures emphasized. And it's not, I think the question is provocative and interesting, and I'm glad you asked it, but like at the same time, I think that whenever Black folk are off doing something, being joyful, creating things, it's like, why haven't you mentioned this? Or why are you doing that? Whereas, don't you want dope ass stories? Don't you want dope stories? The more people who can tell stories, the doper it is. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with all those things. I was just sitting there thinking, like, do I want a separate path? It's, like you said, it's an interesting conundrum, because I want everybody to be able to like enjoy everybody's stuff, so, but it does seem that because of how capitalism works and the way that we consume things, that we start to create categories anyway, you know. Yeah, one of the things that bothered me about like how people are treating Afrofuturism, just like, oh, is magic and black? Oh, Afrofuturism. you know,
Yes.
you know, is it spiritual and black? Oh, Afrofuturism. Right. And I was like, well, and it started to ignore like tropes of like science fiction, you know, like for instance, I mean, you know, Kindred, for instance, I mean, Octavia Butler herself called it a grim fantasy, right? She didn't really think of it as, you know, the technology of time travel is treated very differently, you know, in that particular story, right? There's not a DeLorean or a TARDIS in that particular story, right? So, you know, it almost seems like, you know, people are going to create these categories and, you know, in order to sell things. And again, one of my favorite quotes from one of my mentors, Doyle Moore, used to always say that insiders see content, outsiders see form. Insiders see content, outsiders see form. And so in a society like ours, it's always easier to sell form than it is content because it's so complex, right? But I have to admit, when I go to Netflix and I want to pick out something black to watch, it's very convenient to see like, oh, black, you know, there's a black section right there. Okay. You know, so I don't know. I mean, we are an audience too. And this is the thing, is like in a capitalist society, everything is fungible, right? Even, you know, and even as we fight against it, you know, it is to be sold, right? So we have to really think about those particular aspects as well. Like even calling a film on purpose like an Afrofuturist film, you know, is problematic to me in some ways. But you know,
because
like who says?
a film is not a pure thing that exists in and of itself. There's
Right.
so many different things that go into creating that product or visual representation, even if it's not being sold. How can we call it a thing?
That's a good point. And I think that's why I brought the question up, because I struggled with it myself. So I'm in marketing, right? So MCSFO is a marketing company. So when you think of marketing, you think of, you know, when you're trying to sell your product or sell anything, you have to think about, you know, who's your target audience. We want to think of naming and putting categories and being in these boxes, and no artist likes being in a box, right? People are going to put you in a box whether you want to be in one or not, right? So sometimes it's good to get ahead of that, and by, you know, naming your film maybe Afrofuturism, people may be looking for Afrofuturism, maybe looking to invest in that new, what, you know, they call new genre, and they want to do more of it. But if you don't want to have, so it depends, you know, that's why it's such a struggle sometimes, because it works in our favor in a lot of ways. Obviously, we have films that are in, you know, or, you know, black, it might be a black film, or, you know, that, you know, people are looking for that. And so when you're looking for something like that, you want to give people what they're looking for. Right. So, but if we didn't have a section or a place where you can find it, and it was just mixed in with everything else, then it would be hard to kind of to pick that out. But it's also an opportunity to celebrate that genre, and when you're looking for that and you really want to see more of that, so it's one of those things that, you know, it really depends on how you're looking at it. And so that's why I had to throw that question out to the table there, because I just thought it was such a conundrum, as John said. But
it's a great question.
Yeah, it's just something to think about as filmmakers are creating films today, you know, and have already. So my next question is for filmmakers, again, who are may have already wrote something that they are not sure if it fits in Afrofuturism. As I mentioned, there's a couple of films that we got that some of the judges are, you know, working on and looking at that, you know, not sure if it falls in that category. Isis, can you think of anything that, you know, a film that you feel hit all the right notes and marks, that check all the boxes, if you will, if there are boxes to actually check? I mean, don't get me wrong, I know Afrofuturism is definitely still a broader understanding and definition, but just for the sake of those out there who are really trying to make sure that, you know, they want to inspire and they want to do all these great things, and they're like wanting to make, you know, make sure that they're hitting all the right points. Is there anything, Isis, that you can think of that you might have seen?
So I'll speak to the films that I watched, not naming any titles. There was one where you have this young woman, and I guess her grandfather's in hospice, right? So she gets this technology where she can record their time together so that she can replay it and interact with those memories in her mind. And she gets so caught up in the technology that she's actually missing being present with her grandfather in those last couple of days, right? And the young woman is Black, the grandfather is Black. When we watch this touching short, it feels very Black Mirror, right? Where you have future technology that's disrupting or maybe re-rupting like our everyday lives, and she ultimately gets the lesson. But it did look at like how Black people are potentially might interact with technology in the future, and how they have a unique relation to it due to how we move in the world, like her wanting to maintain that connection to family. So I enjoyed watching that. I think it's potentially representation of Afrofuturism. Not everybody would like look at it and include it in the genre, but like for me in the space I was in when I watched it, I enjoyed it. Now, in terms of creating a framework of what's required for a short film to be included in Afrofuturism, I'll let the rest of the panel like speak in terms of expertise in that. And knowing that, like, as John said earlier, like the definition in and of itself, the original definition left room for it to be fungible and to be redefined. So yeah, I'll stop there.
So, so if a film has Black characters, but the narrative does not include anything dealing with Black culture or experience, and those characters could have been, that story could have been easily swapped out with an Asian family, or with an Indian family, or with the Mexican family. What makes that more of an Afrofuturism type of film if the culture and the experience or anything deeper than that is, you know, if this is something that anybody could have experienced? That's what we're getting into right there. That's the meat of it.
Yeah, I feel that Afrofuturist stories center Blackness and Black folk, you know, personally. That's just my opinion about it. You know, that part of the aesthetic, the cultural movement is to, you know, actively, I mean, it's in the name, is to look at Black futures and Black pasts and Black experiences. So yeah, I don't know if I want to get down with something that actually could be switched out, you know, unless you know, because colorblind casting happens all the time in Hollywood. But I'm like, you know, if you don't make adjustments, you know, when you switch out, you know, that particular actor or that particular family, color blindness is still a type of blindness, you know what I'm saying? And so for you to say that you don't see, oh, I don't see color, I don't see race, then I said, well, you know, perhaps you should get your eyes checked, because along with those particular experiences come, you know, this body and this particular history. And I think that those, and again, to kind of piggyback off of something some other people were saying, it's like race does function like a type of technology and should be talked about in those particular spaces, I think, actively. The other thing is, you know, for me, for like a, and this is for some Black horror too, I think Black folks should win. You know, I really think that if you have like a Black story, that the Black protagonist should win. You know, and this is actually a rule for like writing young adult, you know, novels and stuff like that. The kids should win, right? You should go through the mess, you should go through the turmoil, but at the end of the day, we should triumph. You know, because we've seen ourselves lose so many times, and we're still losing things right in front of us. Just turn on CNN. So I'm like, those are the things that I think about when I think about an Afrofuturist space.
I agree. I think a place where I do think, even though literature and music are also there are many people's hands in the final product, I do think there are things that exist now that simply did not exist 10 years ago or 20 years ago in representation. And I do think young adult literature is the place where I'm most interested in seeing how things grow. I'm just finished reading the second of the Tristan Strong books, which are a trilogy, which I feel like, you know, I feel that they're Black speculative art, period. And there's past, present, and future, and it's steeped in Black diasporic culture. And people will miss these things if they're not looking at what is made for children per se, because that's where our parents were watching the Bugs Bunny cartoons with, you know, Bugs Bunny putting a bone through his nose and getting cooked by Like that we know that there's representation that has been fed to us as natural and normal, but this creates and deifies in a very real and non-imperialist way African and African-American folklore heroes and cultural and the oral story tradition. So it's very much, you know, it's very much necessary for people to look at things that are being made. Like, for example, Soul. If we did not have the little spirit character being voiced by a white woman, that potentially had a lot of, that could potentially have Afrofuturist or Black speculative elements, but it didn't get there because we had Tina Fey voicing the soul who was trying to figure things out. But this Black teacher, jazz musician, you know, there are moments in it where we could see the potential for this speculative turn that is Afrofuturist per se, but they don't quite get there because it's Pixar. But there are elements and moments that we can tease out. Think about Watchmen, Lady Night. Again, Lady Night reappears in Tristan Strong books, but she's a boo hag, right? She's a witch, and we learned that a witch is only a witch, like a trickster is only a trickster if you're deeming it psychotic. It depends on what they're doing and how they're functioning in society in these cultures. So we really need to, you know, start to educate ourselves about the images that we're consuming, the mass media, and how those things do and do not serve us. But I agree with John. We must win. We must see some hope in the future. Everybody must not die. There should not be gratuitous Black suffering, even if it's not about racism. That's, to me, that's not Afrofuturist. That's some kind of tragedy porn, especially in film, in the representation of film. So I think we have to be aware of not doing all things for everybody, but definitely being aware of what you're consuming and what you're delivering and whether or not it tells the story that you want it to tell. You got to have other people look at it and ask whether or not there's stereotypes and other tropes that are science fiction tropes that are harmful and dangerous. We have to ask ourselves those questions, like any artist, professor, store owner. You have to do research. You cannot just have the product on the shelf. You have to do your due diligence before, I think.
Quickly, I just say that there is universality and specificity. So just sort of piggybacking off of what everyone has said, you know, I am a fan of Jane Austen. Like, this is sort of like not a secret shame, but anyone who knows me knows, like, I love the shadiness of the sort of drawing room, you know, drama, right? Jane was not thinking about me when she wrote those stories. At all. I'm not sure that she thought my ancestors were really people, to be honest. I mean, she wrote Mansfield Park and she included a little, you know, thing about how slavery was terrible, but I don't think she was really thinking about Black folk, to be honest. The stories that all these European masters that were raised to read and think are the classics of literature, they were not thinking about any of us on this Zoom, right? But if a story is good, we can glean things from it. So I would say to filmmakers who are thinking, I want to make my story more universal, kind of going back to what you were saying about colorblind casting, right? There's a way in which sort of aiming for neutrality is inherently problematic because it doesn't exist. And who's to say a really poignant story about, you know, a Black person experiencing some aspect of their Blackness in a particular kind of way, or their queerness or their ability or what have you, if it's a good story and you can move beyond your inherent bias that we all have because of internalized white supremacy and homophobia and ableism and all these other things, right? And you can get to the story, right? Then the story will be good, but we don't have to excise cultural specificity to aim for universality.
We've been forced to connect with a lot of things that we have no role for decades. Like, how many years, you know, we've been living in a world where we didn't have those personal experiences, but we literally were thrust into that. So it's a good point.
Yeah, no, it's about extension of empathy, right? Yeah, because my favorite superhero is Daredevil. And I love that little blind boy. I love him. Seriously, I mean, and my whole thing is like,
Exactly.
if I can extend my empathy to a poor, Irish Catholic kid in Hell's
Mhm.
Kitchen, then surely you can
Mhm.
extend your empathy to me.
Exactly, exactly. On that note, I think you guys have actually answered my last question, which was some of the things that you would encourage filmmakers to think about when creating, any kind of narrative around Afrofuturism. And you've mentioned several books that I think were important for them to read if they don't know anything about, Afrofuturism. If anybody want to run down some more books aside from the ones that you already mentioned that filmmakers may need to read. I know a lot of filmmakers. She has a library behind us. So go ahead, girl.
I would say something accessible for filmmakers is going to be here in the Black Futures Project that Kimberly Drew and Jenna Wortham edited. And you're going to be able to really see all these different forms talking about Black folks in the future and how we document ourselves in multiple ways. It's not expensive and it's accessible. There's also and my brain is drawing a blank, but you can find Afrofuturist films that have been made. There was a series that was curated by Amir George and
Yes.
Aaron.
You talking about the Black
The
Radical
Black
Imagination?
Radical Imagination.
Yeah.
The Black Radical Imagination. There are things that you can look at for examples. And I do think you have to do your research and be engaged in that way. You can't just make something with a happy ending with Black folks, because that is not going to get you all the way there. But I think you have to speak to people and ask why things happen and why things are significant. One thing that I always think of as futurists in many, many ways is the ways that our folks will wash out the Ziploc bag and you find plastic silverware in the dishwasher, or reusing styrofoam plates or the plastic bags. We're not talking about some new green whatever. This was just a technological development that our forebears engaged in because we know that there's no such thing as a way, right? So again, climate change and what happens to people in natural disasters and how they're impacted. There's so many, the field is so wide open, but there are lots of books and things that you can find and articles and interviews. I think reading interviews of folks producing these things in the genre, not in the genre, and the cultural movements, I think is really, really important. And not just thinking about it being your own navel and your own idea and your own genius that's creating something, but what is out in the world already that you can tap into and learn from. That would be my parting advice.
And John has a ton of comic books and things that people can read and probably maybe be so inspired to actually do a film on. They can contact him to do a movie version on one of his comic books. But those is another example of some narratives. John, do you have anything that you can think of that might be the most, I guess the one that's on the top of your brain that you can refer people to?
There's so many. Yeah, that's the thing.
No, I know.
Right now, I think I'm really liking Victor LaValle's Eve, which is a graphic novel. And thank you for bringing it up, by the way, because in the original essay, 4 out of the, that Derry did, 4 out of the 5 images that are in that essay are comic book images, by the way. People tend to forget that.
Isis, your bookstore, anything that people should be inspired to kind of read? I mean, filmmakers is about research. A lot of times people are rushing to run out there and create a film immediately without doing research and reading. I can't tell you how much I stress to filmmakers every day who has an idea for film. They spend so much time looking at film, they forget to read. So anything that you can suggest?
I think particularly for short films, looking at short stories makes sense. John did a great graphic novel adaptation of After the Rain, which is which is based off a short story by Nadia Corfor. I'm traveling, so that's why you don't see a bunch of books behind me. So I apologize for that. There's a collection of short stories. So Ayana showed Dark Matter. There's Black Sci-fi shorts, which was published this year. There is Midnight in Indigo, which is a collection. Okay, yes.
And Mothership. There's another ship.
There's Mothership. So I think looking at, yes, thank you for having After the Rain. So looking at short stories just to get like a structure of a story. So at least you know, like, is the story good? Because you like know, like you have an idea of the story, and then like if it fits, you know, like Afrofuturism, it's like any other genre of sci-fi. Like there's some basic tenets. Like if you're going to talk about the Orishas, like there's some basic tenets of like Orishas and so forth. So reading a short story kind of gives you an introduction that's easily digestible, and then reading a collection allows you to like compare, contrast several different stories and several different ways to develop setting and characters and so forth. I definitely suggest looking at graphic novels. They're great. Exciting. To me, it's a new way to interact with the genre, because I'm either like reading words or looking at pictures, and with graphic novel, you're doing both at the same time. It's just like, oh my God, where's this? But it's super.
There's a lot of visuals out there too. There's just a lot, even music. I mean, you can get inspired by so many different mediums, not just reading in literature, as we mentioned before. I think my first introduction to Afrofuturism was visuals. So I started seeing African aesthetic and African clothing, and you know, mixed with like futuristic looking, you know, designs, and merged that together. And I was like, oh, so I had a visual introduction to it initially. So all those things can be extremely inspiring. But I thank you guys so much for coming on this panel and helping to you know, dispel any kind of like myths about Afrofuturism, to kind of like broaden our perception of what Afrofuturism is, and to inspire filmmakers to create, you know, more within this movement or genres, whichever you want to call it, but let's just call it movement. So thank you, Susana. Thank you, John and Ayana and Isis. Thank you guys so much for coming on this panel. I really appreciate you guys.
And I just want to plug one last thing. How long till Black Future Month?
Oh,
yes.
Yes.
And the beginning of the there's a tarot set actually too that I find. Let me pick up the box.
Go get it, girl.
If she has the Octavia E. Butler tarot set, I'm literally gonna rip out my heart.
I do not have it yet. I do.
Okay, because I was like,
but this is Dust to Onyx, which takes Black cultural figures and historical and literary figures and puts them into a kind of arcana and way of working. And the introduction to this book is so inspiring. It's the intersection of all of our work in terms of visual art. And again, it doesn't seem like it is a thing that's related to film, but yeah, How Long Till Black Futures Month and the Dust to Onyx work is just chef's kiss, as they say, in terms of, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Can I say one thing really super quick? What you just, I wanted to mention, piggyback off of what you just said, Ayana, like N.K. Jemisin, if you go to her website, her website is dope and like has lots of different things. She gives these workshops about world building. Right? So if you're thinking, and it could apply to short story writing, to novels, to video games, to films of any length. And she has a PowerPoint that I keep on my desktop. Wow. Not even a fiction writer like that. I'm like, oh, this is just such an interesting way to think through building a world. So going into like, you know, background and research and all those kinds of things. So it's on her website. And she also did an episode of Ezra Klein's podcast, the Vox podcast or what have you, where she helps him build out a world. So then you can hear an audio representation of taking a person through, you know, how you would do some world building. So I think it would be really helpful for filmmakers.
And she's working with archetypes, not stereotypes. She's working with the archetypes. She's working with the mythic underpinnings of existence and universality. And that's why she's a beautiful, badass fantasy writer.
Yeah,
literally. Sorry, Susana.
Top five. Oh yeah, no, we're here. Top five and not number five. Like she's
yes.
Yeah, no,
yes,
for real.
Absolutely.
Please do yourself a favor and read Far Sector, her Green Lantern series. It's so good. Far Sector.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes.
I'm waiting for the bind up to come out, which comes out in November. Yes, this is Sci-Fi will carry it. And John posted in the chat that Megascope is doing the adaptation of Red Dirt Witch to a graphic novel. So I'm excited. I know it's going to be on my Christmas list. I'm not quite sure when it's coming out, but yeah.
Yeah, those are, I think a lot of filmmakers watching this panel right now is going to be like, wow, I got a lot of homework to do. You do, because again, in order to be a great storyteller in general, it's really more being a student first, and reading and absorbing and understanding and learning and broaden it so that you have all those tools in your arsenal to now create and bring out something within yourself. So I think there'll definitely be, they'll have like a lot of stuff to read and to, study. And I'm looking forward to seeing more great work and inspiring more filmmakers to, create more Afrofuturism type narratives and stories. So thank you again, guys. Appreciate you guys so much.
Great to see you all. Nice to meet you, Susana. This is our first time.
A pleasure and nice to meet, but I've been a fan for a long time. So it's a pleasure to meet you.
Hopefully we can get a chance to do this again soon. Part 2.
Yes, I love it.
Be great.
All right. Take care.
All right, guys. Take care.
Have a good night.
Bye.